Hello everyone, here I have a PS4 and it has an issue with the HDMI port. So it says no signal, sometimes it has a signal, sometimes it doesn't. Now, there could be two issues, either it could be your HDMI port or it could be your encoder chip. So I have this handy HDMI tester and it has all the pinouts for the HDMI. When you insert it, then you can test all the pins. Now, this is where all the pins go to. First, you can test all the grounds. So we have 2, 5, 8, 11, and 17 should all be grounded. And they also go to, some other pins go to filter caps and things. So let's test out the grounds. So those are the pins that you could test. And you want to make sure that there's no continuity between each of the coils between pins 1 and 3, but there should be connection on either side of the caps there. So you want to test that out following along.
And with the in continuity mode, you want to test 1 and 3. 1 and 3. 4 and 6. 7 and 9. 10 and 12. There's no continuity, so that's okay. And then ground, you want to test, you can just go from the chassis here, and ground will be 22, 5, 8, 11, and 12. 17. Which are all good.
Now, if the HDMI port is good, then it's probably your encoder chip. This is MN864729, and I ordered that. And to remove it, what you want to do is put some flux on each of the 4 corners of the chip. And then you want to heat up the chip. I'm just going to preheat the board because there is a big pad underneath the chip that needs to also melt the solder. And so at 200 degrees, just heating up the board for about 5 minutes. And then when the board is all warm, you can increase the temperature, and that will then melt the solder on all the little pins, and then you can remove the chip using some tweezers. With the chip removed, now what we need to do is clean up the pads by removing the old solder. I found the best way is to use a chisel head soldering tip to remove the old solder, and I found that this was even better than using the solder wick. Then what you want to do is put on low melting solder, and I'm just using some flux here, and then just using your solder iron, just go over all the pads so that you can get some low melt solder on each of the pads for our new chip. Now, if one of the pads kind of stick like this and you have a blob of solder, just add more flux. Flux is your friend when you're doing these kind of small electronic repairs. And then just increasing the heat a little bit on your soldering iron, maybe like 360 degrees. The same here. I just had the low melt solder on the tip of my soldering iron, just putting them on it like so. And then I put some flux over the solder, and then I'll just run my hot iron over that to make sure that each of the pads has some low melt solder. The reason why we want to do this is because we're going to be using heat to put the new chip on to the circuit board here. So I'm just doing the right hand side of the pads there, and just quickly go over it, making sure that each of the pads has some remaining solder on it. Do the same for each of the 4 corners using the same procedure. And having a ball of solder on the end of your iron tip is an easy way to get the solder all on there. And then you can also put a little bit in the middle. After that's all done, I'm heating up the pads there, and then just put the chip down. The first pin should be on the bottom left-hand corner. Heating up the board, and it should flow into place there. And just tapping it with your tweezers, you can see it kind of move there. And just push down lightly in the middle just to make sure that there's contact to the printed circuit board. After that, use an isopropyl alcohol to clean up all the flux. And then we can put the machine back together and test it out and see if it works. Also, I checked with the scope, make sure all the contacts are good on a little angle. It's really hard to do this without a scope, so I would recommend not to do this unless you have the tools to do it. There we go. I just plugged it back in. You can see we're getting the signal now. So indeed that this was a HDMI encoder error. Usually it's one of the two. It's either the actual HDMI port or the encoder chip. But if you use that little testing thing for the HDMI, you can test the pins. If the pins are okay and they're going to the encoder chip, then it's probably either a bad coil or your encoder chip, like this one. I hope that your PS4 is back in working condition, and if you like electronics and want to learn more about how to fix them, you can subscribe to my channel.